Okay, what I'm going to show is a web service being called from InforOS in the cloud using Cloud Suite distribution through a workflow. I'm going to show you initially just a quick example, then I'll go through the guts of how it all works. So let's start with Cloud Suite distribution. I'm going to go and I am going to go create a simple order. What my web service is going to do is it's going to take an order number, and I'm using a piece of software called Bartender that exposes itself as a web service. I'm sending in essentially a JSON file with the order number, and it is going to print out a label with the order number on it once I create the order. Again, the web service could be just about anything, but that's what I had handy to play with. And I'll show you, here happens to be my Bartender server and in my printer, so you don't think I'm making stuff up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go create an order, and I'm going to add a product to it, doesn't matter what, and I'm going to finish the order. Okay, so that creates order number 69. What's going on in the background now, that is sending a BOD to InforOS. InforOS then is reading that BOD through a workflow. The workflow is then executing an API call off to my server, which lives on premise here, and it's calling Bartender. So if I've got everything right, and there we actually saw a job come through, and I saw a print job created. If I had my webcam working, which I don't, I could show you the label, but essentially it looks something like this. It'll just spit out a label on my printer if I were to let it go. So I'm going to delete that one out of there, and we'll go into the guts of what's going on. So I'm going to start first of all in Ion Desk and show you my activation policy and my workflow. So I start with a workflow, and again, I'm not going to go into creating the appropriate workflow and stuff here. I'll just explain highlights of mine. I am looking at this data. The way it sends it is it sends the order and the order suffix together. So what I do to the order is I trim off the suffix, and then I go send it to an API. So the API is actually where the magic happens. I've got an API called MCI API. This is the operation that's happening. I'm doing a post to this, and I've got some security on it. So I'm doing a post to this, and it ultimately sends an order with the value of the order to that. The API tester here allows me to test it too, so I could type in an order here or make something up, and I could do a test. And if I were to show you, it goes and creates again another document. So that's how I know my plumbing is correct. I will tell you, I am more of an engineer type. I am not a developer type. So I know how to make stuff work. I don't know how to make it pretty. So anywho, so that's the workflow. The workflow then is activated by an activation policy. So this is the criteria that calls that workflow. These are the attributes I'm pulling out of the BOD. These are the conditions that call it. Basically, I'm saying any order that is in the open stage, call my workflow test API. and there's my rules and more stuff. Again, I'm assuming that you know how to create this stuff. If you don't, we can certainly help you with that. So anyway, I've got activation policy and workflow. Okay, so that does the magic. But now the other piece behind the scenes is the API. The API is created in Infor API, and let me go to the main screen here. I have created an API called MCI API. I just gave it a name. I gave it a description. I gave it a context. Context is what shows up in the URL. And once I did that, then I've got to tell it where to go. My server is going to a server called Bartender, and this is actually my web service that's exposed to it. So it's going to this URL, assuming I've got right certificates and all that kind of stuff. This is the data I've filled out here. Again, I'm not making it authenticate against my service. If I wanted to, I could. Then I have some documentation created for that API. This is a Swagger doc. This is important because it tells the rest of the system how this API works. So this API accepts this type of JSON. It's an order, and then it's just got a string for the order, and that's what gets passed on to my label. If you need to know about Swagger, there's a good site, Swagger.io. Editor.swagger.io is an example of how to create one of these. But that's what makes this. So we'll go through in a second, and I'll actually build this all. Okay. So that's the API, and that's the gist of it. Okay, what I want to go through now is actually want to essentially build this from scratch. I'm not going to build the complete workflow. I'm going to make copies of the existing ones. But first thing I need to do is InforOS needs to communicate to my system. So it needs to do that somehow. The way to do that is to create an API. So I'm going to go add. And it is going to bring up a list of pre-created ones that Infor knows about. Well, they don't know about my API, so I'm going to create one. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it Brian API. Sweet name. Again, this is just well, I have to look at the documentation. This is just a name, but it's used throughout, so I'm going to call it the same API and Brian API, and then you got to give it icon, whatever you want to do. If you want to upload a picture, whatever you want to do, that's fine. And my test API. Okay, so there I've got the basis of this created. Now I've got to point it somewhere. So an endpoint. So this is where the magic happens. So HTTPS. So this is my web service, and I got to go look at my Swagger doc. Oops, hold on here. I got to look at my Swagger doc to find it. There it is. So I'm actually going to go to, I got a URL called test-API.com/integration/order/execute/target, and I'm going to ignore certificate errors. Again, if your certificate is valid all the way through, you don't have to ignore that. What I ran into is the certificate I have on my system, it doesn't like the certificate authority, so I get a message if I don't do that. So I'm going to give this a description, my sample API, and I'm going to give it a proxy, something like public. And you see, as I build that, it builds out my URL. I don't have any security on it, so I'm just going to go anonymous, and I'm going to go save that. Okay, so there I've got an API, at least at a location, but it doesn't know how to talk to that API yet. That's where the documentation in the Swagger doc comes in. So I'm going to add my Swagger doc for this. So I'm going to go Swagger. I'm going to go Brian API, I'm going to call it. And my URL, I've just got the Swagger doc out on one of my web servers, support cpport.mcigb.com/API test swagger.json is my file. I do save. Now, if I did everything right, I should be able to go in here and I should be able to see the documentation for my API. Likewise, I should be able to now go in here and test my API. So let's go do that. So back over here, you can see my printer's paused, so we'll see the data show up in there when it happens. I'm going to go do a post, try it out. I can put in something here, 9876, give it an execute, and it shows the crow command that goes and talks to the API with all the security and all that kind of good stuff. And my response is order 9876, and lo and behold, I do have an order out there. Okay, so that's all cool. That tells me that my API functions and is talking back to my internal system. Okay, so let's move that out of the way. Let's go now put it all together. So right now I've got an API that communicates with myself. But now we got to go do the workflow part. Okay, I'm going to leave the activation policy alone. What we'll do is we'll probably just change it. I'm going to go to a workflow though, and let's make a copy of this one. So I'm going to take a copy of my test API. We're going to call it Brian API, and I'm going to save it. And then we're going to do a couple things in here. Okay, so let me delete this out of here. All right. So I've got just some rules or notifications or whatever. Again, I've got notification. Then I trim my order because again I don't want the suffix to print on my again, just an example of doing something with the data that comes in. Then I am going to talk to an API. Now, I can only talk to APIs that were added to InforOS or ION. So let's call this Brian API, Brian's test API. Okay, if I do a select here, it gives me then a list of APIs that were created. So I'm going to select Brian API, do a search, and because I've got that Swagger doc out there, it shows me how to use the API, and I can pick a piece of it. So I'm going to pick that piece, and I know that works because again I tested that. I tested that through the API test. Now the other piece to this is I need a service account. This API needs to be able to talk to the rest of the system. A service account is created from the user manager. So if I go to user management and over on the left here, manage service accounts, I'm going to go create a service account. So let's do that. So let's just create a, call it Brian API service account. And if it's associated with a real user, which I'm going to, it then inherits the permissions of that user in InforOS. Now, I'm not 100% sure as to how this all works, but it is important if I'm making the API talk back to something like SX Enterprise or Cloud Suite distribution, I need to authenticate into the system, and that's what I'm doing here. So I'm going to add myself to it. I'm going to save it. Then I've got to download the magic keys that were created. So I'm going to save it in my downloads file. Let's call it service accounts, Brian API. Give it a save. Okay, so there I've got my file that Ion API is looking for. If I go back to the Ion API, oh, not Ion API, I'm sorry, back to the workflow, what the workflow is looking for. So the service account, I have to import that file. So I'm going to go browse. I'm going to go out to my downloads, and I'm going to go find that service account file, give it an open, give it an OK, and there it is. Okay, so now I've got the basis of this API created. It's still not complete because I have to do something with it. So let's follow the screens. I don't have any parameters. My request body, though, and this comes again from the API, I have to now tell it to send. I want it to send the order from the workflow to my API. So quick example here, it goes out and again reads that Swagger file, and my Swagger file says it's an order string. Well, I don't want the word string. I have to replace that with something from my workflow. So if you look down at the bottom here, press Control Space or Control Alt Space to include a value parameter. So I'm going to push Control Alt Space, and it brings up a list of parameters that are in my workflow. I'm going to use the order. Okay, and I'm going to save it right there. Let's go back into it. So I've got my request body, out the parameters. I'm not sending anything out from this. I could. Then I'm going to go test it. Test it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Send a test. And again, back to my other system. Oh, there you just saw it pop in there. So that shows that my workflow went to my API. My API then talked to my local system and created the document that was necessary. Okay, so that's cool. So let's make sure we are all saved and good. I did save it, so we're good. Always a good idea to keep saving these things as you're working along. So I'm going to start that workflow. Okay, then I'm going to go into activation policies. Okay, I'm going to shut down the one that's there. So let's deactivate that one, and I'm going to make a copy of it. So let's make a copy of it. We're going to call this one Brian API activation for test workflow. Instead of using test API, we're going to use the one I just created, Brian API. So let's go through this for a second. It looks at a sales order document on the sales order. So it looks at the sales order bod. On the sales order bod, it looks at these pieces and parts of the bod, looking for these conditions. So I'm printing any stock order in the open state. It's going to send it, and actually it has to be in warehouse 10. And then I define the rule. Then I've got to do the parameter mapping. So out of this, I'm sending the order, the suffix, the type, and the warehouse. Okay, I'm going to save that baby off. And again, let's go back to activation policies, and we're going to turn it on. Okay, so now I have something looking at, again, let's go into it. I have something looking at the order bod, sales order bod, and when it fires then, oops, I keep clicking the wrong thing. It then fires this Brian API. I'm going to turn off my test APIs, and I'm going to turn off my other API just so that we know it's all a single one. So there I've got my API. Now let's go back into Cloud Suite distribution or SX or whatever we want to call it. And let's go create another order. And we're going to see that it sends data again to my web service. Let's just stop here. And again, this is bartender. Bartender's pretty cool for this kind of stuff. So I'm going to stop it. I'm going to start it so it clears out my logs. There we are. Move that off to the side. So I'm going to go again, use a customer, go next, find a product. Doesn't matter what product. Oops. We use the hammer. Add it. I got my picture. That's all fun. I'm going to finish. And that's created number 70. And we can go back and watch it happen through on desk. And I should be able to go look at active workflows. And I should see this this increment when it hits it. Again, the bot has to be created. And it has to flow through the workflow. So if I did something wrong, I'm not going to see it. So there I saw the workflow fire, and it completed, and it created the label, and I'm going to let it go. And my printer is firing up behind me. And again, you'll have to believe me, but it's going to have a label on it that says 90. Again, the web service could go post to a web page, could go do some other things as well. So hope you find this helpful.